This is Still Here, Still Queer, Now What? The podcast, your companion to midlife as a queer person. I'm Dr. Paul Taylor-Pitt, the author of Still Here, Still Queer, Now What? The book, coming everywhere, 21st of October. Today's episode, we spend a lot of time talking about books. We spend a lot of time in The Queer Bookshelf, which is the book by my guest, Layla McCay. This is such a wonderful book. The Queer Bookshelf, a reader's guide. We talk about it. I will just say right now, I love this book. Look at the number of notes I have in there. I was lucky enough to interview Layla for an event at Queer Britain in Pride Month. They were doing a Meet the Author event. And Layla and I have known each other for a while. Layla was interviewed for my book. She was part of the Soho House Midlife Queers panels. And I was delighted to be interviewing Layla. I realized that there was so much that I wanted to ask. We just couldn't fit it in. And so I invited Layla to come back on the podcast and carry on the conversation. So we talk about the Queer Bookshelf. We talk about her first book, Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling. Actually, that was her second book. Her first book was one called Restorative Cities. She's very prolific. She's got a fiction book coming out next year, which we talk about. It's just such a lovely conversation. Layla is incredibly humble and, very endearing in the way that she's still so surprised by her success as a writer. And so I was very happy to be with Layla, talk about her work and celebrate the amazing stuff that she's doing. I now think of her as the godmother of the literary LGBTQ plus community. I can't wait for you to dive into this conversation. I invited Layla to introduce herself. I would think of her as a power lesbian. I don't know when Layla sleeps. Like, Layla does so much with her time. Not only is she an author, she's a health policy expert. She hosts The Moth in London. She also described herself at one point that she was quite a big deal in the Scottish Rocky Horror fandom. There's so much. We barely scratch the surface, but we do a deep dive into books. So sit back, enjoy, get ready to add to your to-be read pile. Here's Layla McCay. If people haven't met you before, how would you like them to meet you today?
I am an author of non-fiction and fiction queer books.
Which is different since the last time we had you on the podcast.
Well,
Like,
exactly.
which is really exciting because I feel like when I interviewed you for the book, which is now coming up to about 3 years ago, I think you had one book out at that point, Restorative Cities.
Well, yeah, that's right. And then, of course, we had Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling, which is about LGBTQ plus people and how that affects us on the career ladder. Which very fun was just featured by Lean In, which is a really big women leadership organization in the US. So it's funny, you think that those books have sort of come and gone, and then actually they still have a whole life, which is a really nice thing, I think, to remember when we're all writing books, and a couple of years later, you need to remember that it's still having a positive impact. So that's really nice. And then, of
So
course,
actually, so let's pause on that. Let's dwell on that because I think you're so right. It's always like, what's coming next? What are we doing next? And sometimes we let those good moments just kind of fly by because actually what I could have also said was, the award-winning author, because your book Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling won an award as well.
that's right. The Axiom Business Book Award, the gold medal for career related books.
Did you actually get a medal?
I did get a medal. Do you want to see it?
Yeah.
Oh wait a
Oh, I
minute.
can't believe that you're not wearing it. I'd be wearing it 24 hours a day. I'd be going around like
Oh,
often
I
if
think
I'm.
I might have put it away somewhere. I thought it was here, but I've clearly tied it up, which is very
Oh,
disappointing. No, I got an actual medal, like an Olympic medal, which is
and
which
that's
is
such
weird.
a.
I'm devastated. I can't think where I put it because there's no other moment in my entire life that anybody would want to see this medal other than right now. But one more moment. Let me just ponder whether I put it in this cupboard. But
This is such an Oscar winner thing, isn't it? It's like, oh yeah, I'll just keep it in the toilet downstairs. I don't even think about it. It's like I would never take that medal off if I had won it.
I found the medal.
Ah, amazing.
Here it
What?
is.
That's massive.
Look, it's like a proper medal.
That's like a marathon medal.
Exactly, with a really thick strap to like wear around my neck. I'm trying to imagine the instance in which I would wear this medal around my neck. But it's like it's amazing. Um,
Going to a shop.
I can't think of the time I've ever. Well, I guess I've won some sort of women leadership awards where I've got some kind of trophy. But I've never won a medal. That's the sort of thing that you would get for running, which I certainly wouldn't win.
Although, you know, writing books is like a marathon. So, you know, in that
Exactly.
respect,
I'll be
you've
getting a medal just
earned
for
that many times. What kind of conversations have you had about breaking the rainbow ceiling since it's been out?
So lots of different people have asked me to come and speak mostly to LGBTQ plus staff groups and employee resource groups, and sometimes come to their organization and have conversations about how do we address these challenges. Uh, Obviously, the premise of my book is that if you are LGBTQ plus, there are various ways in which you're held back in your career. There's also some ways, you know, that are positive, but I think that probably the overall gist is that there are lots of things that are barriers. So quite a lot of employers have asked me to come and talk at employment related events, workforce events, to have a look at actually what can be done about that. And that's been really nice because I've had some really interesting conversations with people who, you know, whose job it is to make sure that everybody gets fair opportunities. And that has been such an inspiring conversation because I sort of have a vision that I write a book and then I put it out in the world and nobody ever notices. And you know, I went to one of these events which was with a big sort of IT organization, and people came with their books, and some of them had all the
Yeah.
notes with their highlights in it. And I thought, oh my goodness, isn't it lovely that people are reading this book and caring about it? And like people have come up to me at conferences that I've spoken at and have said, even in one case, actually, one of the exhibitors came up to me in a conference and he said, "Excuse me, your book had this really big impact on my life. It caused me to come out at work, which really improved my life. I got a promotion. All these good things happened as a result, and it's because of your book." And I mean, it is very humbling when somebody says something like that, isn't it?
That's amazing. And also, what else would you expect? You know, in a way, I think there's this real tightrope that we walk, and I think particularly for you in the times that we've spoken, I think you have such humility around the work you do. What else would you expect? Like you wrote an amazing book and included so many different voices and your own wisdom. And yeah, what's the alternative? It
I
doesn't
think it's
change anyone's life.
well, I mean, first of all, there's the I wrote a book, but is anybody actually going to read it? Which I think is quite a big thing because there are far too many books that come out. Essentially, you could say compared to how many people are able to buy enough to turn a profit. So I think it's a very crowded market in the book space. And I think that bookshops have struggled to understand where to put Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling. Some of them
Yeah,
have put it in the gay section, and
yeah,
some of them have put it in the business section. Some people have it in smart thinking. Like
yeah.
it's quite hard to find in a bookshop. You're never quite like, you know, obviously like a nerd. I sometimes go into a bookshop and look for it, and I always have to look in about 4 or 5 places before I spot it, and it's usually somewhere different. So I think that writing at the cross section of different genres can be quite tricky for a book. So I'm excited when people find it and they read it. And then, of course, because I continue to be filled with imposter syndrome, which the book will tell us we're more likely to have as LGBTQ plus people, and also as women, um, I always just fear that they might think the book's rubbish. So when somebody
Yeah.
tells me they thought it was great, like that is slightly traumatic and, of course, very delightful.
I love the idea that bookshops put it in different places because to me that shows that it could fit in all of those spaces.
Well,
So if
that's
someone
the
is
thing.
looking
I
for a
don't think it
business
should
book,
be.
it's there.
Yeah, I'm not like it should be in that other section. I don't really know what section it should be in. It sort of depends, you know, who's browsing and looking for what. Ideally, they would just buy multiple books and put it in all the sections.
Exactly. It should be on every shelf. And there's something in it for me there about again, it's like, well, what do we expect? It's a book about queer identities. And so it's never just going to be one thing. It's never just going to be, here's the story and this is the solution, this is the answer. I think the book raises so many questions, but also it does give some really good advice, both from the people that you interviewed and from your own experiences. And I love that it's having that impact. I love that people are reading it and then going, oh, actually, this made me come out at work. I mean, how wonderful.
I know, it's really nice. And it's also been quite interesting just in terms of who's stocking it and where they're stocking it. There are some LGBTQ plus bookshops that don't stock Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling because they're, I don't know, more focused on the rights aspect, and
Hmm.
they feel a bit turned off by the concept of people on the careers ladder and striving to be, more and more senior on that corporate journey. And I think that that's something that doesn't always chime well with the style of advocacy and activism that you sometimes see in the LGBTQ plus book space. So it's
Hmm.
also been interesting that in some ways it's too mainstream. In other ways, it's not mainstream
Hmm.
enough. I think it's been a bit of a quirky ride, I think.
Hmm. And I'm so glad it's not over. I mean, why would it be? Like, it's, that's the thing with books. I have some books on my shelf that I've had for 30 years and others that just arrived yesterday. Like and I guess that's the great thing about curating a collection of books is in some respects, it doesn't matter when they came out because I'll go to them at the time they feel important or the time that it feels right. Like I might buy a book and then not read it for a year, but then somehow I'll go, that's the one I need to read right now. So your book is waiting to be discovered
Oh,
as well
exactly.
as the people who've already discovered it.
And I was slightly worried that it would feel a bit dated because it was talking about a time and a moment where LGBTQ plus rights were in a particular place. There's quite a
Mm,
lot of emphasis in the book of the UK and the US, which of
mm,
course have evolved in terms of LGBTQ plus rights and workplace rights, even since the book was published a couple of years ago. But I think that a good thing that I did with this book is to interview people from all sorts of different countries and try to bring
mm,
in this concept that the path towards rights does not flow in one direction. It can double back on
mm,
itself and back and forward and reverse. And because I've included lots of different countries, including ones where being LGBTQ plus was illegal, and then it was made legal, and then it was made illegal again, and what the impact
mm.
for people who had come out at work in the period that they thought was safe. And I think that there's lots of lessons to be taken from that as rights continue to change and evolve in all sorts of different countries.
Mm. And rights, like, for me, rights is almost the baseline, the foundation of it, because then we get into things like organizational culture. And certainly over the last decade or so, what I've seen, well, I think I've seen it shift actually in the last couple of years, but maybe the 10 years previous to that, lots of organizations were saying, come out at work, bring your whole self to work, be who you are. And then as that's kind of shifted, I really worry for all the people who did come out or who did show up and say, actually, this is who I am, because then the tide changes and the culture changes. And they are then exposed without protection. They are out in the open going, well, you told me to bring my whole self to work, and now you're telling me you don't want that part of me anymore. And I'm now subject to debate. Like it feels like in this country, even though the rights may not have changed, the culture has really shifted.
I think that's absolutely right. I don't know if you've watched the series Tiptoe yet,
No, I can't
which
bring myself to watch it.
I honestly can't either. I've only watched the first episode, and then people keep telling me they find it so traumatic that they're
Yeah.
having nightmares about it, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to subject myself to that quite yet. But in the first episode, which I did watch, which is what gives the series its name, one of the characters is like, they tricked us. They told us to come out and everything would be fine, and then we did, and we were our, I can't remember the wording, but essentially we were our whole fabulous selves, and we danced into rooms, but actually things have changed, and now I tiptoe. And
Wow.
it's a really poignant moment, and, it really struck home for me because I was like, "Gosh, I still try to be, as visible as an LGBTQ plus leader as possible, but
Yeah.
I feel more conscious of it than I did even a couple of years ago." And
Yeah.
it makes even my book makes me feel anxious. One thing when I wrote Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling, it felt really important to me to have actual people quoted in the book with their
Yeah.
names, with their jobs, because there are so few visible role models for LGBTQ plus people that it is really
Yeah.
cool to see actual people, not like Bob Anonymous, or whatever
Yeah.
it may be. So that felt so important writing the book. But now I'm like, gosh, what if these people who really generously contributed have some kind of issue as a result of participating? I think, it's a funny time, and
Mm.
we don't know where things will go. But right now, I think it is really nice that people can still buy that book and open it
Mm.
up, read about people's real, true stories that they are sharing, see where they are, follow them on LinkedIn, be inspired by them on a daily basis. I think there's still a lot of positivity in the world. There's still a lot of really brilliant queer leaders. On the other hand, in the book, I wrote of the Fortune 500 companies, which is, the 500 biggest US companies, only four of them had publicly out LGBTQ plus CEOs, which is obviously such a small figure. And when the people from Lean In contacted me to participate in something with them, they said,
Mhm.
I thought I better check whether that number is still the case. So I spoke to my friend Fabrice Houdard, who runs the Association of LGBTQ plus corporate directors. I think that's his name. Um, and he said actually it's down to one.
Wow.
I know.
Wow. And I hope that one is not Tim Cook.
No, no, I think Tim Cook has gone from that role now. It's
Oh, that's so shocking.
I know, I know.
That's so
So
shocking.
I mean, not because they've been like fired, they might have retired or whatever it may
Yeah.
be. But what we're seeing is either the people who are being recruited into those roles, people are, disproportionately recruiting people who are
Yeah.
not LGBTQ plus, or they're recruiting people who feel unable to be public
Yeah.
about the fact that they're LGBTQ plus. We can't know which one of those it is, but nevertheless, it feels. I mean, it just feels a bit uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Mm. Yeah, I thought you might say, "Oh, it's gone up by 3, and it should have gone up by 30." But for it to go down to 1 makes me feel like I hope that that one person is okay.
Oh, quite.
Save that one person, protect that one person.
Yeah,
But and
exactly.
oh, wow. God, that's really surprised me.
That one person is Beth Ford, the CEO of Land O'Lakes in the US, and she has been out for many, many years.
And you send her some chocolates and flowers and say, "Keep going. Keep doing what you're doing." Um, if you were to write an updated chapter for Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling, what do you think you would focus on that maybe wasn't so front of mind when you first wrote it?
I think that I might put in more of a sort of action list type of a chapter, because quite a lot of people have asked for that, and that's what I provide when I do talks. But
Mhm.
people are like, okay, if this is the sort of environment we're working in, what are the top 5 things that you can do as a manager, as a colleague, as an LGBTQ plus person to
Mm.
things fair for
Mhm.
LGBT plus people? And that, I mean, that information is in the book, but I think that a little sort of workbook chapter might have been
Mm.
quite a tempting addition.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do we do about it? Something
Exactly.
that takes all of that thinking and then turns it. Mm.
Yeah, and
And
that question,
also,
what do I do about it in an environment that is very conducive to LGBTQ plus equality, or one that
yeah,
perhaps isn't, and in various sort of political experiences. I think there's all sorts of interesting things to think about there, isn't there?
yeah. It feels like there would be a need for a second edition a lot sooner than I would have imagined.
Well, quite. But as I say, there is the benefit that I'm not just looking at countries that had at that moment strong workplace protections and a
Yeah.
for diversity and inclusion. Um,
Yeah.
because it looks at lots of different countries, it does give us that understanding of what to do in different scenarios. I always particularly liked one person who described, as an employer, you can think of your workplace as a little embassy. So no matter what is going on outside, you need to adhere to the rules of wherever you are and how those apply to you. But within that context, you can make your workplace inclusive if you want to. You can make
Hmm.
that enable people to be their whole selves at work if that is what you want to do, and
Hmm.
you implement things that will reduce discrimination and inequalities if you choose to do that.
Hmm.
And I think that's quite interesting, I think, for people who are managers, who are employers, and thinking actually, what will I do in whatever the context is that they happen to be in.
Hmm. It's an interesting piece of history to be living through when we look back on this time from wherever in the future and go, oh, look at the organizations that were really committed to us and look at the ones that just vanished or the ones who went very quiet.
Yeah, I think people are taking all sorts of different approaches at the moment. I mean, I think
Hmm.
we can see that with Pride this year. It has been quite a muted affair, hasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So another reason to be really happy for your current book. I feel like I'm positioning in this like, so we had your first book, Restorative Cities, and then your award-winning second book, Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling. I want to talk about your third book, The Queer Bookshelf, which is here and covered in post-its. Because then you've got your fourth book due out in 2027, which is your first novel. And then you're also working on a fifth book at the moment. So I feel like even talking about like breaking the rainbow ceiling, it's like, oh yeah, that was book two. I'm on book five now. Like this is the life that you're in, is just being a prolific author.
And it's really fun because, yeah, when I was writing Breaking the Rainbow Ceiling, I wasn't writing it in a I am launching my author career. I just wrote it because I wanted to read that particular book and I realized it didn't
Yeah.
exist, so I decided to write it. Um, it wasn't because I was thinking, gosh, what multiple books can I write? But having written that, and realizing that there were a lot of people who wanted to talk about things in the workforce space, I was like, actually, it would also be really fun to go and like talk about things in the bookish space because that's where
Mm,
passion lies. Um,
yeah.
so again, I was like, it would be useful to be able to read a book about LGBTQ plus literature, not from an academic perspective, but from a cultural importance, historical importance sort of a perspective. And again, that book didn't exist, or not that I could find. So I decided to write it myself. But I think that having done that, it now feels like I've got enough books under my belt that I started to think of myself a little bit more as an author. And that idea in my head of, gosh, what am I going to write next is now there instead of, am I going to write something next? It's a sort of um, what rather than if.
Yeah, it's like it's no longer negotiable. Like you will keep writing, and I love that, and I love that.
Yeah, and you know
Again,
what?
it's
I'm not writing. I just feel like I feel itchy. I feel irritated. I want to be writing something. When I'm in the swimming pool, I like my head to be like thinking about the chapters of my book. And when I don't
yeah.
have that, I'm thinking about work or something.
Keep thinking about books. So this book, The Queer Bookshelf. You and I'm just going to hold it because I feel like this is such a precious book. I love this book. I was so lucky to read an early copy and I was reading it on my Kindle and highlighting loads of things. And then when it came to an event that we did together at Queer Britain, I thought, oh, I can't just be sitting with my Kindle. I need to highlight the pages. And I realized how many of the pages I had highlighted with a number of different things. Some of them are books I want to now read, which is just going to cost me a fortune. Some of it were quotes from other writers who had told you about their favorite books, which I loved. But I think most of the things that I highlighted were things where you talked about yourself. You talked about your experiences as a reader, as a queer person. And it, like, what I love about this book so much, and I know that I've told you this a few times, but I'm going to keep telling you until you hear it. This this has to be a classic in the future. because I don't think it's just a book about books. I think you've captured the history of our community through the written word, and you do it in a way which to me just feels so, um, like I want to say the word comforting, but it's not even comforting because it's really provocative at times. Like the book made me really emotional as I was reading it because it taught me things I didn't know, and it took me to places I'd never been, and it left me feeling really hopeful. And so while it on the surface, it may be, a reader's guide, and for readers, there are so much in here. For me, it's so much more than that. It really is like this history of our community. Was that what you intended to do?
I don't think it was, I think when I first had this idea, I was like, it would be really helpful to know what books are significant in LGBTQ plus literature. There's so many books, and actually, historically speaking, culturally speaking, literary speaking, what are the inverted commas important or significant books? So when
And
I
for
started,
who? Like, who were you picturing having that conversation for? Like, who were you writing it for?
so I was writing it for people who are interested in queer books, love reading queer books, but maybe have mostly only really encountered them from the 21st century, even from the
Mm.
last decade. I think that um, there are a lot of people who I encountered at different book groups and things who could tell me all sorts of things about the books that they really, really felt passionately about, but they had only been published in the last couple of years. And
Mhm.
when I mention books that are queer classics like Tales of the City, by Armistead Maupin, that a while back, every single queer person who was interested in books would know about that book. They had read that book, even if they hadn't read it. Like they were aware of why it was important. But these people hadn't even heard of it, and it wasn't because they were stupid. It wasn't because they weren't interested. It was because there wasn't an obvious route to access that sort of information. To say, "Gosh,
Mm.
here I am as a queer person. Actually, what are the significant books for my community?" And I thought it's fair enough that they don't know that. How would they? Because as queer people, we it's not a generational thing. It's not a thing that our parents would know and pass on to us because often our parents are not queer. And unless we luck out and happen to come across some queer elders with some good book knowledge and who are in the mood for being a bit of a reading mentor or a history mentor, then that's information that might pass you by unless you're very determined and you go and hunt it out. So I was thinking it would be really nice to be able to put things like that into a book that was accessible, that was fun, that people were able to just go and read the book. And I think I've joked to you before that I sort of imagined it like if you were going to a queer literary dinner party and you hadn't really read any queer books, but you wanted to hold your own and sound like you knew what you were talking about. You could read this book as a quick primer in all things queer literature, and then sound very informed. Um, and that is a handy thing. Obviously,
Always.
I like that, but I think it became something more, and I hadn't necessarily known it was going to become something more. I hadn't known it was going to become a memoir. Like I do
Mm.
not think it's a memoir, but people keep telling me that it has memoir vibes, and that's an interesting observation because had I thought of it as a memoir, I might have written it differently. I don't know, but
Mm.
I when I was writing it, it didn't occur to me to think of it in that context. But I know that the publisher has put it in various different categories, and one of those categories is memoir, which I just find really confusing. And then in terms of it being a history book, as I started doing the research, it wasn't just about the book itself, all the stories that surrounded the book and how those books came to be at that time in that place, why they didn't come to be, how they like appeared and disappeared and then were rescued decades later. Like all of those sorts of things just were really, really interesting to me. And I thought, well, people are interested in the book. They're going to want to know this. So I added it in because I wanted to know it. And really, I wrote it for people like me, people who just love to read. They're not super literature academics. They're just people who love books, who are interested in queer books, and want to know a bit more about them. And in writing them, I guess it became queer history through the medium of books, and that was a
Mm.
surprise and a delight. I think.
I love, and again, you've just done it again, which is the thing I experienced so much when I was reading the book is I went, oh, I've never thought about it like that. The way that you just described the generational thing that we don't live in those structures where queer books are passed down from generation to generation. Usually, I would find it very surprising if someone's, traditional cisgender heterosexual family passed down Tales of the City.
Well,
I mean, they
exactly.
might.
My mother
They,
thrust the Jane Eyre into my hands and things like that. But it's a very different kettle of fish, isn't
yeah, and so maybe you're like the godmother of the community now, like the literary godmother of the
it?
community that we can
You're
all
gonna have
go
to
to
become
and
a bit
go,
more sage before you could call me that.
it's very sage. It's very sage and it's very funny as well. And I love that it does feel very inviting to read. Like it's not something which, you need to brace yourself for. It's like you just go into it. And we had a lovely conversation at Queer Britain. I was very pleased to do that with you. And I had so much to talk about that we didn't talk about. I actually ended up with like 3 pages of questions that I didn't get to ask. And I'm not going to suggest that we go through all of them, but I wonder if I can just pick out a few more different things that we never had a chance to talk about that we can then just put on the record.
Go for it.
So much that I learned and so much that I still wanted to talk about. Like, so, and again, this is the funny side of you, which I think is brilliant. You said, you remember watching the play Angels in America with your mother and then discussing it during the car ride home in a tone that tried to suggest that this was all very objectively interesting and nothing to do with me personally. I know exactly what you're talking about there. I feel that. Like those moments when you were growing up and you were like, "Ah, there's something that is queer, but I can't talk about that." Like, do you remember that conversation about Angels in America?
Gosh, I do so much. And it was weird that round about the time when I was 16-ish, 15, 16, my mother and I started to go into the theatre in Glasgow quite a lot. And for reasons that I do not know, there were lots and lots and lots of plays with LGBTQ plus themes. Like very strange. In the middle, I mean, obviously it was targeted towards adults, but it was in the middle of section 28. There was nothing going on in terms of queer inputs in books. There was very little in terms of the television or film, but we kept going to the theatre almost every week. There was like this brilliant LGBTQ plus themed play, and my mother always, she wanted to discuss all these plays, and she liked to think about the meaning and the philosophy. So yes, I would always have to be like nodding along and trying to think of something intellectual and objective to say about my assessment of this, as opposed to saying what I was actually thinking, which was, my goodness, it's so exciting to see queer people.
Mm,
I wonder whether the actors are queer. I wonder whether the director's queer. Like,
yeah,
were there people in that room with me who were also LGBTQ plus? How would I know? Could they tell that I'm LGBTQ plus? Would somebody come up to me and say, "Hello, do you want to have a conversation about how I can tell you're a closeted lesbian?" I always sort of both wish and fear that that was going to happen, because I was like,
yeah,
I don't know how to cross that Rubicon.
yeah,
And have conversations with queer people. And it felt like when I was in the theatre watching those queer plays, it was in touching distance.
yeah. And then it was like, oh, well, now I need to put on my theatre critic hat and just talk about this like from a very objective perspective, because there's nothing at all to do with me. You also said tipping the velvet, which I also learned was Victorian slang for oral sex.
That's correct. I was wondering what
Oh,
term you were going to give us a translation there.
didn't know that. Tipping the velvet was the first romantic gift I was ever given. My first girlfriend wrote inside the book that it would get me through a very uh,
Very
oh I,
heterosexual Christmas, I think it said.
yes, I wrote a very closely Christmas with my relatives. I don't know why. I'm going to try that one again. Tipping the Velvet was the first romantic gift I was ever given. My first girlfriend wrote inside the book that it would help me get through a very heterosexual Christmas with my relatives. Did you have to like sneak it in and hide it?
Well, exactly. I had come out to my parents quite early on, and they had not taken it very well. So I'd sort of gone back in the closet, and then I had left home, and it just wasn't discussed at all. But after
Mm.
I'd left home, I got this first girlfriend, and feeling feeling very queer in the world. It felt it just sort of felt confining and a bit depressing to be returning to the family home as we all do around Christmas time in Scotland, and being in this setting where I felt like I couldn't be myself, and
Mm.
there's something just really diminishing about that sort of experience. So there was a particular joy in having this book just in my suitcase, and if I was feeling if I was feeling like I was outside myself and that, you know, I I couldn't be seen for who I was, and I felt that feeling of being diminished, I could just sneak into my bedroom and read a little sneaky chapter and, feel connected in and feel seen in that sort of way, and, you know, spend a moment thinking about that girlfriend who didn't last much longer than that, probably only another couple of weeks, but nevertheless, she was there at a key moment and, yeah, really had a big impact on how I felt about myself during Christmas with the family.
Yeah. I think that first Christmas going back home, I took a copy of Tales of the City, which my friend Laura had introduced me to,
Oh, I love
which I'm
that.
always so grateful for. Laura, I always thought of Laura as being quite exotic. She was French. Her dad was an ambassador. And I remember her saying to me, like, something about Tales of the City. And I said, "What's that?" And she was like, "Stop." And she gave me a coffee.
This
And
is
I took it
this
home
is
because,
how we ideally will be passing literature from one person to another, and "Have you read this?" and "What are the books that people share with each other that have such a big impact at that time?"
yeah. And I remember it so clearly when she was just like, "You have to read this." And I mean, I'd come out to my parents when I was 15. And so by the time I was going home for that first Christmas, I was 18. And I remember in the car ride on the way from the train station to home, my mum asked me if I had a girlfriend. And I just remember thinking,
Didn't we
still,
just have that conversation?
we're still having this discussion. What's that about? And it wasn't so much like a denial. It was more like, oh, but have you not just tried? Just give it a
Well,
go.
yeah, that's the thing, and I think that's the misconception, isn't it, about coming out, that you have this one big dramatic moment and everybody has their big response, and then you've done it. And it sounds like both of us have that experience that you kind of hope and thought you've done it, but people just keep on circling back, going, "Oh, maybe it was just a phase."
Yeah. 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 My mum was like, but your friend Andrea, you're such good friends. I was like, yeah, because I'm gay. We're such good friends. Um, what else do we have on here? Like I never, again, and something else I learned, children's literature contains very queer coded bachelors like Big Ears in Noddy, Pooh and Piglet, and Ratty and Mole in Wind in the Willows. Like I'm now thinking of them as completely different relationships. I never thought of them in that way. And then as soon as I read this in your book, it was almost like, not that I not that I started to think differently, but I started to wonder why I'd been waiting so long for permission to be able to think about them like that. Why with a fictional mole would I assume it was heterosexual? And it was almost like reading this made me go, oh no, I could be thinking about this differently.
Yeah, I think it is interesting how we are so indoctrinated to assume that everything is heterosexual and that that was the intent, and that that's how we need to think about things, and that it's almost transgressive to think about them in different
Mm,
ways. Now, with those examples that you've given, it is pretty unlikely that the author, in fact, intended those characters to be LGBTQ plus characters, and nevertheless, I think that there's just something so interesting because for everything except for queer things, we embrace different types of readings, don't we? That's
yeah.
why literary criticism exists. That's why the whole discipline of literary studies exists. That people look for different interpretations within a text. But there is something weirdly transgressive about that. And when I like though that chapter or that section of the chapter is probably one of the most controversial parts of the book, and people who have read it who are not LGBTQ plus feel quite challenged by that concept, I think. I mean, even those of us who are queer, maybe, as you say, feel a little bit challenged and taken aback by it. But people who have their own heterosexual interpretations, like some of them have taken it as a bit of a personal insult that I could suggest that their beloved characters could, in a particular lens and interpretation, be LGBTQ plus. But you're quite right. Like, who's to say what sexuality a rat and a mole have? Like, that is something that we can all bring our own experiences and our own lenses to, and say, actually, do I see something of myself in that person? And I think it's really interesting that the series Frog and Toad, which is probably a lot more popular in the US. So I've had more reactions to it in the US. But Frog and Toad, much beloved series by Arnold Lobel. That author eventually transpired that he was gay, and as such, I think that we can look at Frog and Toad in a different light, knowing that this author was gay all along. And what does that mean for what he was thinking about those characters? So I think, it's confusing to know what to think of that. And some people have in fact criticized the whole chapter and said, well, you're just like grasping at straws here. You should actually be highlighting the fact that there were pretty much no LGBTQ plus children's stories until extremely recently. And yeah, that is another valid perspective, and that is true. And he's like, why, why would you dignify the amount that was available by suggesting that you could read it into those? But I think that reading queerness into the characters that we identify with is such a queer thing to do. Like, many of us who love books have done that in different ways. And yeah, I guess thinking about, wait a minute, what about Bilbo and Frodo in The Hobbit? Like, I always used to think about Anne of Green Gables and her bosom friend Diana. Like, we project things onto different characters, and I think that good literature is able to expand and absorb those different reflections and different lenses and mean different things to different people.
And if people get really upset about the fact that Frog and Toad might have been in a same gender relationship, shouldn't they be getting more upset about the fact it's a frog, a rat, and a toad? That's the thing I'd be more concerned about, is like, why are these two different animals together? Not the
And
fact that they
I
both might be male.
That's a really interesting point. I do think that hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? Of what people find upsetting, and what they think is legit, and what, I guess, what we have been trained to think is a perfectly
Yeah,
reasonable thing. Like, completely happy that a bear and a pig might be friends in Winnie the Pooh, but if you suggest that they might be having some kind of romantic relationship, that is absolutely beyond the pale. Like,
yeah.
I don't know.
And
I
yet
think
people are quite happy for Kermit and Miss Piggy to be shagging.
well, exactly. I think we bring weird societal norms into the way that we think about things, and sometimes reading things queerly means moving beyond those societal norms to say, what if? Thinking
Yeah,
in a creative way, thinking in the sort of way that children can sometimes think, who
yeah.
are constrained by all these prejudices and expectations.
And then that really ties nicely into the other thing I was going to highlight, where you said I was late to science fiction and fantasy and held silly prejudices that these books were not for girls. Where did you pick up that?
I don't know. I think I must have picked it up in school. My parents didn't read sci-fi or fantasy, so I don't think they would have had much to say about it either way. There were some people who read sci-fi in school, and they were mostly boys. The books, they had a sort of boyish vibe to them, didn't they? They
Mm,
were sort of in blue colors. They like I think that we were trained quite early on that if it was a book for girls, it would have girls on the front cover, maybe a bit of pink. And if it was a book for boys, then it would have like a rocket ship. Um,
yeah,
so
yeah,
that goes back, doesn't it, to wider gender prejudices that our society really instills in us from an early age. And I very much bought into it. I used to read the Babysitter's Club. I was lots of girls on the front covers of those. I would read Anne of Green Gables, but I wouldn't read those really interesting adventure books. I didn't feel they were for me, and somehow people had persuaded me that I wasn't interested in that sort of thing. And I now realize, having become more interested in science fiction, particularly, and sometimes fantasy, over the last decade, I thought, goodness, the whole point of science fiction is to play with ideas, to think about what society would be like if something
Mm.
different. And it gives you the permission to think about queerness alongside all sorts of other different things that we take for granted in our society. And why on earth was I not allowing myself access to those thought experiments and interesting adventures when I was younger? I think I really just felt constrained by what people told me was appropriate for me to read, either as a girl
Mm.
or even as an intellectual. I used to, in high school, style myself as quite an intellectual, and there's a certain snobbishness I think about what some people call genre books, particularly things like science fiction and fantasy, where you're like, oh, it's not literary fiction. Whereas I think we perfectly well know that it can be as literary as you want. And also, even if it's not that literary, so what? We all should be reading the books that bring us joy. And that's different things for different people. And just because I read Jane Eyre one day doesn't mean I can't be reading a nice sci-fi book the next day. I think that we should be embracing diversity in reading.
And it's like layers and layers of exclusion. So even though, I was very into sci-fi, and maybe that's because it was okay for me as a boy, there were no queer characters. You can watch the whole of Star Trek up until, you know, recent times. There is not a single queer character. You can watch all of Star Wars, not a single gay character. And and again, that's reinforcing it. And yet, for me, those were places of discovery. I watched Flash Gordon, thought, yeah, I'm gay, but it was a love story. Star Wars is a love story. Like there's so many heteronormative kind of tropes that get thrown out through those spaces, even though it's about imagining new futures and new worlds. It's like, yeah, even things like the Twilight films and books, which are more recent, it's still a love triangle. Oh, two men want the same woman. Which one will she go for? Like so often the authors just miss a trick when it comes to going, if I can believe that there are these people living in space, or we can believe that someone can turn into a werewolf, or we can believe that this is set in 5,000 years' time. So where are we?
Well, I think that part of it is anxiety about not being able to get the book published if it goes against any sort of norms and expectations of the time. You're particularly talking about watching films or television series, which were subject to different codes where
Mm,
difficult to put an LGBTQ plus character in, and if they did, it was subject to potentially being banned or censored.
mm,
So people would be less likely to do that. They would also, be very anxious because making those films are very expensive, and the big focus is on making a profit. And this anxiety that if it was banned in certain places or certain people were not allowed to see it, or it was given because it involved queer content, it was given a higher rating. So, like, you had to be
mm, mm,
to see it, it would reduce the number of people who were paying to see it. So there were all sorts of restrictions there. I think that books in some ways had a little bit more flexibility because
mm,
you could do things a little bit more subtly, couldn't you? And you sort of pop them in so that people didn't necessarily notice unless they knew what they were looking for. And when I was doing the research, I was interested that actually me with my own societal assumptions, which I had been trained for my, younger part of my life, I was trained to see heterosexuality. Um, it's still quite hard to spot those things where queers
mm.
turn up. Like, I was really interested, not about sci-fi particularly, but Wilkie Collins in The Moonstone and The Woman in White. There are very clear queer characters in those stories, but just read them without even noticing. I think that's quite interesting.
They were there all along. Um, Something that we did talk about at Queer Britain, which again, from the way that you wrote the book, I found really fascinating, was the idea that you mentioned earlier, where we kind of we follow the flow of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. It it helped me to break some of the patterns I've been holding, which is that progress is this linear thing. And I saw through your writing, like I thought of it as like this queer advent calendar, like a window opens in between difficult times. Suddenly we explode into the world again, and then something comes along and closes the window. And you talk about uh, coming to the end of a golden age of queer books. You talk about um, maybe looking at the future differently. And I read that as not necessarily meaning, oh, queer books are going to go away again, but that it might become so much less of a thing. Like, what's your thoughts on the future of queer writing? Like, where do you see it going?
I just think it's a really interesting question, and I don't know where it's going. I think that, as you say, at the moment, we have lots of great queer writers who are writing interesting, diverse stories about different aspects of queerness in a way that we haven't really had to this magnitude before, and we certainly haven't had so popular in the mainstream. Um, but yeah, there is this really interesting question of what will become of LGBTQ plus identities overall, not just in queer,
Ah.
but will we continue to really understand LGBTQ plus identities as something separate from,
Hmm.
heterosexual cisgender society? Or will the younger generations take a more fluid or flexible definition of sexuality and potentially
Uh-huh.
gender, and not feel the need to define themselves at all, in which case there's every possibility that this concept of queer literature wouldn't really be a thing anymore. There will just be literature in which people may have various sexual and gender experiences that's just
Ah.
fit in with the societal norm. Now, I don't know whether that's going to happen because we still operate in a society that shows quite a lot of prejudice and othering for people who are not in that heterosexual cisgender
Hmm.
mainstream. But, it's possible to imagine a world in which those differentiators just lose their importance and lose their meaning. And that's that could mean the end of explicitly inverted commas queer literature. And there will be good things and bad things to that if it happens. Who knows?
I mean, I'm fascinated by the, I don't know if it's a cultural thing, like a younger person thing of willing or wishing two seemingly straight men to be in a relationship together. So the things that come to mind, and I know very little about this, but I know it's a thing. I know that there is a huge kind of online discussion about whether Harry and Louis from One Direction are in a relationship or not. And not in a bad way, like in a, here are all the clues. And this is coming from predominantly straight women who are going, yeah, they are, they're together. And then the whole heated rivalry stuff around, the stars of the series, even though they may or may not be queer, there's a lot of investment from the fan base that they are together. And we have proof, and we saw, and he touched him on the arm. And I find it really fascinating that in some parts of society, there is this almost like an encouragement of queerness, maybe where there isn't any queerness. And so I wonder if it does become more, not more acceptable, but maybe more commercial, that actually we want our heroes to be together. We want our heroines to be together. We want people of all different genders to suddenly be like, yeah, we are front and center of this in a way that has never been demanded before.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what to make of that, isn't it? But in some ways, I think it's well, I mean, quite often it's heterosexual women who are having this sort of a conversation, as you say, and I'm interested when I follow on social media lots of conversations around this topic. And quite often, gay men will come on and say that when they engage in these conversations, they are excluded from them and they're told that this space isn't for you. And quite often they will experience quite a lot of homophobia from that very same community that is so
Mhm.
enthusiastic about two men getting together in a romance that involves two men. And
Mhm.
it's my theory that in some ways they think of it more. I mean, I don't know. Everybody's had all sorts of theories, haven't they? But I think that people think of it as more of a metaphor than an actual embracing of queer life. I think that in many ways, if you're reading a romance novel as a woman, there is something quite liberating about reading about handsome men who you are attracted to, um, who are having a romantic relationship without misogyny or gender politics interfering in
Mhm.
that they are able to engage with each other in the sort of equal way that many women might hope uh, male female dynamics could mirror.
Mhm.
And also, when you're reading a romance and it's about people like yourself, you can't help reading yourself into those characters and
Mhm.
relating things that are happening in those books to things that might have happened in your relationships. And there's also a theory that actually by enjoying these handsome men that you find attractive in a relationship that is not like yours, then
Mhm.
it is a much easier effort to enjoy that escapism that is offered by that book because you're not
Mhm.
being distracted by thinking of yourself in that scenario. You're actually just able to enjoy it. So those are some of the theories that I have heard. But I think, you know, it it feels like the people who enjoy those books are not necessarily the same people who will read literary fiction about queer people. I think I think those are quite separate audiences in many, not in every case, but in many cases. And I think that there's a lot of anxiety within the queer community that there's some fetishizing going on of
Mhm.
gay men in particular. Quite often, the books that are about two men are very much more popular than the books that are about two women. In For people who are not queer who are reading those books, and uh, many gay men have told me when I was interviewing them for the book that they do feel quite uncomfortable with the expectations that suddenly straight women have of them as a result of reading
Mhm.
these books that might not necessarily equate with reality.
I mean, you've blown my mind again. I had no idea that that was the case because then it also takes me to, I was thinking, well, what's the equivalent? How many straight men would project on two women being together? And I was just thinking, oh, well, every porn film ever made. And th- there's a, but there's a different power dynamic. Like I've often thought of, straight men who see, um, two women together as some kind of spectator sport. Like it's for their entertainment. I'm here, you perform for me. And if straight women are doing something similar to gay men, then that's fascinating. It's
It
not
really
great, but
is.
it's
I mean,
fascinating.
there's probably many PhDs in that where smarter people than me can really understand the sociological drivers of that. But
Yeah.
yes, you're right. It isn't the same because, yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Quite often, while both could be described as objectifying the same gender couple or however many people are having a
Yeah.
relationship in the book, um, men are probably watching it from an angle of imagining that they could turn up and
Yeah.
be part of this, whereas
Yeah.
potentially women are appreciating the slight distance that they have from it and being able to
Mm.
it from that angle. I mean, that's just a theory, but yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, and in some ways, it's really good for queer writing, queer publishing, because there's a growing demand for these books. But in other ways, people are a bit uncomfortable about it because these books are written primarily for an audience of heterosexual women. Quite often, they are written
Yeah.
by heterosexual women for that audience, which again can cause some depictions of queerness that don't always feel helpful for
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus people. But again, it varies a lot. So it's an interesting concept.
It's fascinating because well, I mean, that's your next book now. That's that one sorted, an
Okay.
exploration of
I don't
gender
think
and sexuality in literature. Because then it's making me think, not, I mean, I don't write fiction, but if I did, I would just write a romance between two men and I would publish it under a pen name of like Paula Taylor-Pitt. And then I'd just be and I'd make a lot of money and it would be empty, hollow art. There'd be nothing to it.
but
Um,
just
I'm
think of
not,
all the riches you might acquire.
yeah, think of the
That said,
mansions.
that is quite a crowded field, so it's not a fail-safe plan.
Do it for the mansions. I've got through three questions from my 3 pages, but already I'm just going to put those aside for another time because I do want to find out about book number 4, which is your first fictional book, which comes out next year and just sounds amazing about a book smuggling ambassador's wife.
Exactly. Well, a diplomat's wife, yes. So it's called A Diplomat's Guide to Book Smuggling. And yeah, it is about a woman who wants to travel the world, but for various reasons is stuck working in a bookshop when she meets a diplomat who can't get sent overseas because this is set in the 70s in the UK where gay men were not allowed to be diplomats. So until he was able to prove that he was super heterosexual, he was kind of stuck in his career. So they decide to get married and off they go to Washington, where they're trying to obviously be undercover as and be the most heterosexual couple on the block. But then the woman starts to find queer books and become really drawn in by the joy of reading queer books and wanting to share them with other queer diplomats, and thus we get ourselves into a smuggling situation.
So I need you to educate me on one thing because I've suddenly realized I didn't know. What's the difference between a diplomat and an ambassador?
So the ambassador is like the head of the mission. So like the boss of a particular mission. So in the Washington embassy, the most senior diplomat there is the ambassador. That person is in charge of that embassy. And then within that embassy might work like 100, 200 people, and they will be diplomats of all sorts of different grades, all the way up to ambassador.
And you couldn't be a diplomat as a queer person back
That's
then.
right. They saw it as too much of a risk in terms of being blackmailed.
Blackmailed for but they
Uh,
told the
so
reason you could be blackmailed is that they said it was a bad thing in the first place.
yeah, well, essentially, if you are a gay diplomat in the 60s and 70s, you know that if it got out that you were gay, you would probably lose your job, your family, various bad things would happen to you. So if you were working as if you were working as a diplomat at that time and you were gay, you had to keep that hidden. If somebody found out that you were gay, then they would be able to blackmail you because, oh, theoretically, because they would threaten you that they were going to tell your boss or tell
Yeah.
your family or whatever it might be, and as a result, get you to do nefarious things. So yeah, it was a common concern all the way up to quite recent times.
That's incredible. What do you hope for that book?
I I mean, I'm just so excited to be moving into the world of fiction because, as you can tell when you read the Queer Bookshelf, fiction is my first love. And I have delighted in hundreds or thousands of novels over the years. So the thought of being able to contribute something to that is just a really happy thought for me. So my hope for it is that it finds its audience, that lots of people find it and love it and find it, a funny, charming, interesting story, but while they're reading it, they also learn a little something about queer books, about queer bookshops and the history of queer bookshops. And they also learn a bit about actually what is it what did it mean in really recent history to be a
Hmm.
queer person trying to have a career, and what might that mean for our future?
I'm seeing all kinds of like viral marketing about book smuggling. Like I'm imagining the book, disguised in like brown paper or wrapped up in some other book. Like you open a copy of something else and it's in there. Like
Oh my goodness, Paul,
you
I
could
need to
have
hire you to do the marketing.
so much fun with this because then it's like it's got this underground vibe already of like, hey, this is a dangerous book.
Exactly, but it's also just a sort of funny, charming, very, very minor thrillery type of a book. So it's probably got something for everyone.
It sounds amazing. And that's coming out next year.
It is, and well, February in the US, TBC for a UK date.
Fantastic. And what's the thing that you're working on now, if you can talk about it at
Well,
all?
I mean, I've literally only started working on it, so I better not talk about it. But it is another novel, and
Uh-huh.
it also involves books in some way.
There's a theme, there's a pattern. You are
Hard not to say that
definitely
once you start. It's such a rich theme of stories.
you're carving out that place of the literary godmother of the LGBTQ community. And that's how I'm going to think of you from now on, whether you
Love
want
it.
it or not.
Do that.
The thing I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and I asked you before, so I'd be curious to see where you're at now, is to finish the sentence, I'm still here, I'm still queer, and what would you say today?
I'm still here. I'm still queer, and there is so much more that I want to achieve.
Amazing. And you will. I have no doubt of it. And I will be with you every step of the way. If you want people to find you, to buy your books, where should they go?
You can find me on Instagram at Layla McCay, and you can buy the books everywhere. Really, it's been quite exciting. They're on the tables in the bookshops. They're in the windows, and if you can't find them, then they're very much available online.
That's amazing. I can't wait to have you back on next year and we can talk about the next book and
Me
just keep
too.
them coming.
It's going to be amazing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Layla. Okay, I'm going to press stop on that. It'll just upload